Welcome to Detonation Point. I'm your host, Matt O'Neill. I was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years and retired as the Deputy Special Agent in charge of the cyber operations part of the Criminal Investigative Division. In Detonation Point, I'm going inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Welcome back, everybody, to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. I am very lucky to have our next guest, Geoff White. Geoff is the author of the Crime.com, The Lazarus Heist, and Rinsed, which I have right here. It is required reading for everyone that is in law enforcement. And specifically, when I was in the Global Operations Center, I would make sure everybody would read each of those books and then follow his podcast and whatnot. So, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Geoff and I have an interesting way of connecting. Back when I was reading The Lazarus Heist, I reached out to you. Do you remember that?
I remember that very well. Yes. Yeah. I could not forget that message. Yeah.
So I loved the book. I was absolutely captivated by it. Part of the reason was because you write so well. And the other is because we were working the case against the North Koreans who were hacking into banks around the world in Operation Fast Cash. But what caught my attention wasn't that. It was their exploits in the 90s and early 2000s as it relates to the Supernote. Can you tell the audience what the Supernote was?
Yeah, well, this is a sort of fascinating sort of entry point into the accusations against North Korea in terms of its financial wrongdoings. North Korea, as it's sought nuclear weapons, as it's tested missiles, has become increasingly sealed off from the outside world financially. From the US and other countries have sanctioned North Korea, turned off the financial taps. So for a long time, North Korea has struggled. It's also been struggling economically for a long time. It's not a particularly bountiful country in terms of natural resources. It's not very big. And so North Korea has been struggling for cash. And obviously one way that you can get cash, and particularly foreign cash, I mean, North Korea wasn't really allowed to access a lot of US dollars, and it really wanted US dollars like a lot of countries do. One way you can do that is, well, you just make your own. Why not print your own dollars? And so during the course of kind of the 1990s, people started to see these kind of very, very high quality counterfeit banknotes being produced. And obviously there's always counterfeit banknotes. One of the Secret Service's jobs he used to work for is like cracking down on dodgy currency. But these are very, very good. And it's the kind of currency that you can only really print if you really knew what you were doing, i.e. if you had an actual intaglio currency printer, you had a central bank quality printer, and you had access to the inks, the color changing inks that they had. Who would have that? Well, a country like North Korea would have that because they print their own banknotes. And so investigators, particularly as has been said at the Secret Service, started to trace this back, and they found a lot of these currency counterfeit notes in the hands of North Korean diplomats. Now, the North Korean diplomats' explanation for that, to the extent that they did explain it, was that North Korea is deprived of access to normal banking, and so they obviously carry around a lot of cash, and so I guess some of this cash must be counterfeit. But the chances of ending up with counterfeit super dollars, like really high quality counterfeits, so often in so many North Korean diplomats' hands, the assumption was that North Korea is counterfeiting these notes. And certainly that's what the US government has gone on record as saying, is that these were made by North Korea, partly to get hard currency in, but there's also a possibility of trying to destabilize the dollar currency. As soon as you introduce counterfeiting into the system, you can start to introduce concern and worry about the money supplies, a sort of existential issue for the US government. But that's the whole super dollars note. It's absolutely amazing story. And these notes were incredibly high quality.
Yeah, they were. And so I came on in December of 1998 and started in the New Haven office, which is the satellite office of the New York field office, in June of 99. And that was right in the middle of it, where it hadn't even become public yet. So I was always nervous because we would get counterfeit bills coming into our office and we were supposed to look for it. And a lot of it at the time was, we called them P notes, so computer generated notes, just garbage, easy to find. You had the Colombians note, you had the Israeli note, which is other pretty good quality notes, but you could always tell by certain markers, but the Supernote was one that always made us nervous. I never saw one in the wild, but I knew the guys that were working those cases. You wrote about the Lazarus Heist, and you covered it brilliantly, except one minor detail was you mentioned the FBI. And while they did work the case with the Secret Service, I was like, oh man, I know the guys that work the Secret Service, but I loved your writing so much. I'm like, hey, let's talk about some other stuff. And then that's when we got into covering the Ghalib al-Amaris and all that in the world. So anyway, it is an absolute must-read book. Obviously, the DPRK is still active, and now it's hacking into crypto exchanges and whatnot. But let's go back a little bit. You started as a investigative reporter, which is really interesting to me. My background was in electronic journalism as well. I worked at ESPN before coming on. So we kind of have similar backgrounds. How did you pivot from being a technology reporter at Channel 4 to really focusing on cybercrime and specifically your expertise in money laundering?
Yeah, that's been an evolution, and it came about for a couple of reasons that are fairly prosaic reasons, fairly mundane reasons. The explanation I'll give to people about this is that I became an investigative journalist because, I had a hunger for the story and I couldn't help digging. And that is part of it. I do love digging into a story, and I love getting my arms around the whole story, really feeling like you've got the whole thing. You've really found out as much as you can possibly find out about it. It's a very satisfying feeling that. For someone like myself, I'm a bit of a completionist. I like to finish the board game. But the more prosaic reason was this, which was that when I joined Channel 4 News, we were reporting on technology. I was working with a correspondent, so I was the producer, I was in the background, and we were covering the iPad launch and video games and stuff like that. And for a start, I didn't get into news to cover product launch. It's not very satisfying. But also, more importantly, if that's what you're doing, if that's the territory you're in the end of program territory. You're sort of the dog on the skateboard story, we always used to call it in the UK. And the problem with that is TV programs are not like a newspaper. A newspaper, you can always have a few more pages to squeeze news in. A news program runs, and we had 50 minutes, which is a long period of time, but nonetheless, it's a finite period of time. If you're at the bottom of the program, something inevitably always happens. Some breaking news happens that has to go in higher up, and you get forced off the end. So we kept getting dropped off the program. So I was like, well, how do we get up the running order? And A, I wanted to do harder news, but B, for, sanity, we needed to get higher up in the running order. We need to do hard news. We need to do serious news stories. And around that time, and we're talking sort of 2010s, you started to see, obviously, more computer hacking going on, some of the crime cases that yourselves and other law enforcement were working on. You start to see the emergence of the anonymous movement, and we obviously saw things like the RSA hack going on at the time, and you could just tell there was this thing going on. Tech was being weaponized for statecraft and for cybercrime. And so that's how I started getting into it. The North Koreans, obviously in the world of cybercrime, occupy a sort of fairly unique and endlessly fascinating and intriguing position. And also, as you've said, they continue to evolve. And in terms of how I got into money laundering, just to complete that, it's interesting. You can look at North Korea in two ways. You can look at North Korea, as some people do at the State Department and DOJ and so on, as a state threat. And they are a geopolitical issue. And when they steal money, it's sanctions evasion. And when they move money, it's sanctions evasion. That's one way of looking at them. The other way you can look at it is just a crime group. The accusations against them is they're nicking money, and they're doing with it what all big crime groups have to do, laundering it. And so I started getting quite interested in the process of laundering. And actually, if you listen, there's a BBC World Service podcast that I did called The Lazarus Heist, which talks about North Korea's exploits. My co-host, Jean Lee. And people say that's about a cybercrime podcast about North Korea. Actually, if you listen to it, quite a lot of it, arguably most of it, is about money laundering. Getting the money, hacking the money is one thing, and sometimes that's fairly easy. Laundering the money is a whole other exercise, and most of our series is actually about that. So that's what made me want to dig into money laundering and actually in the end write a book about it, that book Rinse that you've got, like really get into how does laundering work, but how does technology change that laundering picture?
We always say that money laundering, especially third-party money launderers, are really the center of gravity that enables cybercrime to flourish. And that's what really drew me to Rinsed, was because it really is something that law enforcement overlooks often. They look at the crime, and then they identify the crime, who did it, who, what, when, where, why, how. But the following the money, the IRSCI, I think, in the U.S. does it as better as well as anybody. Secret Service is pretty good. FBI is pretty good. But it really is, how can we get in between the bad actors and how they actually get whatever they're trying to steal and take it from them? Because then it just rises the cost of business. It was described to me exactly the same way by a guy that I absolutely adore, who worked all of the North Korean cases for the Secret Service back in the Supernote. He says that North Korea is a mafia state. And it operates almost like that, where it's like you got VIGs and you got to pay, and you have a certain number you got to hit. And there's also this interesting dynamic where you have people that are doing the hacking or whatnot for the nation state to make money, but also moonlighting as well. So is it nation state? Is it nation state affiliated? It's a really fascinating thing. And then you bring in a cryptocurrency into the mix, which I'm interested in your thoughts. Do you think it made money laundering easier or more difficult for the bad actors to ultimately get what they want?
Yes, it's an interesting question. How does cryptocurrency feed into money laundering? Does it make it harder or easier? There's a very simple debate that we can get into. It's quite a common one, and people will probably know about, which is that cryptocurrency is almost always traceable. Most cryptocurrencies are moving across a publicly available, publicly viewable ledger of transactions, blockchain. Or types of blockchain, which is necessary for the cryptocurrency to exist, to have faith of its users. But it also means you can trace the transactions. And so the narrative goes, well, why would any criminal use it? It's all traceable. You're going to get caught. My response to that, and what I've tried to point out in the book on frequent occasions, is that it's all very well tracing the money, but that doesn't get you your money back, does it? If somebody steals my TV from my home and runs down the street with it, well, I can see exactly where my TV's going. I just don't get my telly back. So freezing and recovering the money is really, really difficult. And what that does is introduces a delay for the victim or the pursuing party, whoever it is, law enforcement, judiciary. It's hard to follow it, but it's doable. But then it's really hard to freeze it. And it's really, really hard to recover it. While you're doing all of that, it gives the criminals time to push that cryptocurrency further out into more wallets and to get it distributed more often. The other thing I'd say is, if you look at the North Korean example, the amounts stolen in crypto have gone up and up and up and up. And I think when we spoke, the biggest North Korean job was the hack of a video game in Vietnam called Axie Infinity. And that was $625 million of cryptocurrency, which they stole in 1 minute, 55 seconds, by the way. That's how long it took them to transfer the crypto. This year, 22 February, they doubled that, which was already, I think, the biggest hack of all time, like in terms of dollar amount in one go, valued at the time of the theft. They beat that. They doubled it, 1.5 billion stolen from Bybit, a cryptocurrency exchange. That took 2 minutes, 36 seconds. So, they're getting faster as well. If crypto was such a bad deal for crooks, they wouldn't be nicking it in such large amounts. Clearly, it's useful for them. They are able to launder it. There is a giant laundering network now available for cryptocurrency. Elements of China and China's policy on crypto have fed into that. The only caveat I'd add to that is that it may be that in the future, as our computing power grows, as quantum computing comes online, because we can trace crypto, we will be able to pursue people, because suddenly avenues of traceability will become available technologically that didn't exist before. You could have a think about this as a blue skies piece of thinking and think every cyber criminal who thinks they've got away with a crypto crime today, fast forward 10 years, quantum computing kicks in, suddenly we can find all of those people and prosecute them. And we've had a sort of glimpse of that in terms of some of the activity around Silk Road, a very famous dark web marketplace. Years after Silk Road went under and it was all finished, the police in the US have managed to find someone who's one of the Silk Road beneficiaries, trace it through the crypto and get that person because the history of crypto is trapped in amber. It's recorded forever. And so I'm saying at the moment, crypto is great for criminals and they are using it. There is a thought in my mind that maybe in the future that might come back to bite them. But I don't know that by that stage, you probably washed all of your money, got out and you're untraceable. But it is possible. It's feasible in the future. We may turn around and think differently about this.
And you mentioned Silk Road, and I have to say that's good that they caught him. How long until the person gets pardoned?
Oh, yes. Given what happened to our man,
Russell
Ulbricht, who ran Silk Road. Yeah.
So the other thing that I was thinking, and I agree with you, it could be easier, but also we have to recognize that bad actors are much more quick to adopt to new technology, and they're much more agile than, say, the good guys. So when there is, say, the next iteration of quantum or whatever, I would imagine they're going to be all over it, unfortunately, because of just the delays, bureaucracy and banks and law enforcement to even bring on new technology. We're always 2-3 years behind, which is one of the reasons why they were able to run so rampant in digital assets for so long, because it took us a while to even spin up the ability to get expertise on the good guy side at scale in order to track them. The other thing that I'm curious about is, from your perspective, cryptocurrency also provides a second means of stealing something. I could hack into a business and I could steal payment cards, I could steal whatever, and then I still have to launder it. But if I'm hacking directly into an exchange and just stealing, whether it's an exchange or some other sort of adjacent Doesn't that make it somewhat easier because a lot of those organizations aren't nearly as mature as a JP Morgan Chase or something like that? So I don't have to go through the e-commerce. I could just go directly to the source and just take it.
You're stealing the money directly. You make a good point. Banks are regulated. They do fail, and we've seen North Koreans get around their security and other hackers. But yes, the cryptocurrency community is still very new. I mean, people forget Bitcoin was 2009, the white paper, the Satoshi white paper that launched Bitcoin. So still very new, not very regulated. We are starting to see regulation come around cryptocurrency. Places like the EU's got digital assets legislation. US is starting to look at that. So it's coming, but there's still a new industry and still far less regulated than traditional finance. And the other thing is within the cryptocurrency community, when you speak to people, and I have spoken to crypto businesses that have either been targeted and in some cases successfully targeted by hackers, including allegedly the North Koreans, they paint this really interesting picture. They say, we know security is something we should be doing, but when your company is growing massively, when you're getting people throwing money at you, what they want is growth. They want user numbers to grow. They want your bottom line to grow, profitability to grow. What they're all calling for and clamoring for and giving you the money for is that. Not many people, either within the company or investing from the outside and pushing from the outside, not many of them are going to go, oh, by the way, actually take 10% of that and spend it on security. That's just not something that really gets thought about. Of course, if it goes wrong and you get hacked, oh my gosh, you suddenly think of it. Yeah. But for the people who are investing in these companies, they want growth, user number growth. For the people running the companies, they also want that. And you've got a decision. If you're going to turn around and say, we're going to spend 10 million on this piece of technology, it's going to stop us getting hacked. You've got to justify that because that's 10 million you could be spending on marketing or hiring staff. So there's that element to it as well. There's the immaturity of it, but there's also the dynamics of the way these companies are pushing out.
And I've heard you speak about this in other sort of events. You and I did a little bit of a world tour last year in Toronto and New York, and we were at several events together, which was awesome. And you talking about how security is a cost center. And and by the way, if you're an organization and you haven't had Geoff keynote an event, you really need to because I spent a lot of time on the road, and Geoff is the best of the best. And so about the North Koreans as well, there was something last week talking about North Koreans working with Russians. Did you see that report? And do you think that that's accurate, or what's your take on that?
It's a really good question. I did read that report because when we were making the second series of Lazarus Heists, which is it's a BBC World Service podcast, so it's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. That's what they say. I used to leave that to Jean at the end to say because she's got a lovely American accent, so it just sounds better coming from America. We were looking into links between North Korean hackers and Russian hackers. There's a long history between North Korea and Russia, and also China, obviously communist nexus, and we're seeing interesting dynamics around that, around the Ukraine war and so on. So it sort of made sense that there would be crossover. We didn't see a lot of it at that time. There was a Brazilian bank job that we looked into that seemed to have some aspects of it, but it was a bit murky. So when that report came out last week, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Again, the alignments between it looked fairly slim to me. I say that I'm not doing down the report. It's just for me as a journalist, I'm always looking for the slam dunk. Like, oh my gosh, that really stands out to me. There was some crossover sort of infrastructure. It was command and control servers were being shared. And I thought, that could indicate collaboration. Equally, it could be just a command and control server being run by a service provider who just serves lots of different criminal groups and doesn't mind if they're Russian and North Korean. I didn't read into the real detail of the actual report because I got busy doing something else. So for my sins, I need to go back and do that. But interesting line. On the surface of it, maybe. But even if that is the case, that still doesn't point for me to a mass scale integration of the cyber units. And I find that interesting because we've obviously had frontline integration of North Korean military units into the war in Ukraine. As far as we know, in Russian uniforms, among Russian units, what does it take to align the cyber units? Where does that happen? Is that going to happen? I think that's a more gnarly challenge. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
When we were working the Operation Fast Cash, which was the North Koreans were hacking into banks around the world, getting into their payment switch application server and stealing millions of dollars. And you know this, but for the audience, Bank of Valletta, Cosmos Bank of India, Bank Islami, you name it, in those days, we saw it. And it was really good case where we were working with our domestic and international partners to try to thwart their activities. And we did have a lot of success that never really became public. because we didn't want it to become public, because we didn't want Kim Il, who was indicted in California for not only those, but I think for Sony as well. But we did see what you're talking about, using infrastructure that was in Russia, and there was some stuff like that, but I still didn't think that there was a definitive. I thought it was more the latter of what you're saying. They're using infrastructure, because the knowledge that I have of most of these groups, the thing that connects them the most is their shared language. Clearly, they don't have a shared language. And also, when you go back to the earlier discussion about it being a mafia state, I don't know. The jury's still out on that. You can never say never. It's interesting that the Russian cybercriminals were doing basically global unlimited cash out operations long before the North Koreans were, and they basically took the tradecraft. But that's just something interesting to see what's going to happen over the next few years. I'm still skeptical, and I don't think it matters ultimately if they're working collaboratively or not. They're still very destructive, and they're going to steal as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
When you think about Rinsed, again, awesome book. I got a signed copy right here. I help try to mentor new financial analysts, and there's a series of books, and yours are always on the top of the list. But when you covered a bunch of different cases in Rinsed, was there anyone that stood out to you as the most interesting or innovative?
Yeah, what I was trying to do with that book with Rinsed was firstly explain money laundering to people, because I think money laundering has the same problem as cybercrime, cybersecurity. It's something that people kind of know is out there, but it's quite dry and quite complicated, and they struggle with it. So I wanted to explain, here is how money laundering works. And so chapter 1 inevitably is the Pablo Escobar story, because it's lots of people see Narcos. It's a good place to start. It's physical. You understand it. The wrongdoing is clear. Clearly dealing cocaine is a bad crime. And then explain how laundering works, but then explain how technology is starting to transform those different instances. And so I looked into lots and lots of different cases. The one that really, really interested me, I was looking for like a sort of showstopper ending. You're always looking for like the final chapter that leaves people kind of, like at the end of a musical or a stage play where everybody comes on for the final number. And for me, it was that what at the time was the largest hack attributed to North Korea, one of the largest hacks in history, if not the largest, which was this theft of $600 million from this video game, Axie Infinity. For a start, it was just a bizarre journey into the idea that around the world there are stores of value that are completely unknown to us. Deutsche Bank's got a lot of money. JP Morgan's got a lot of money. It turns out this hokey video game in Vietnam you never heard of is worth $1 billion, and there's money in it. So that immediately made it an interesting thing. The video game is based around salamanders and robbing the salamanders. There was also the way that the technology worked within the game. It was all based on cryptocurrency. So effectively, to buy into this game, you didn't buy the video game. It was free, but in order to play the video game, you needed to effectively invest in crypto to have your little characters to play with. So there's all the mechanics around that. There was also a slightly bizarre twist in that one of the things that made this game so incredibly popular and rich was that it just took off. I mean, during lockdown, it took off massively, because people realized they weren't just playing a video game, they were effectively playing a marketplace. And some of them realized that if they played a certain number of hours a day, they could sell the assets they'd got in the video game for actual money. They could convert the crypto back into real fiat currency. And so in the Philippines, there was this whole community of people who were playing this. And of course, that got on the news. You can play a video game and earn a living. And so more people piled on. So you got this snowballing effect. And that was interesting because some people sort of thought this is the future of video gaming. Instead of us just being passive players and paying to play a video game, we will somehow have a share in the industry. We're being taken into the industry and involved in the video gaming industry. So this idea that in the future, this was how we would sort of get work, and the video game industry would be able to share its revenue with the users. Other people said, well, no, this is modern slavery. These people are just bashing away on a keyboard. So there's that whole dimension of like how video games and how the future of work might work. Then, after they stole the money, the North Koreans were accused of taking it to a mixer, which takes in crypto from people, washes it with other people's crypto, and then spits it out to a fresh wallet address, which I'm sure many of your listeners will just think, well, that's just money laundering. Yes, it is. It can also be used to preserve privacy if you don't want your transactions traced through the blockchain. And so Tornado Cash became the laundering mechanism for that stolen crypto. 450 million of it went through Tornado Cash, which did what it's supposed to do and laundered it. And you think, well, let's go after the guys who run Tornado Cash. They've laundered the money. They're accomplices here. The people who built Tornado Cash, they're not shadowy dark web figures. They're actually named coders and developers. Their response was to say, well, yeah, we built this piece of technology. And yes, you can use it for money laundering, but we didn't build it for that. We built it mainly for privacy preserving purposes. And by the way, that code is now just on the internet. So we wrote the code, we published it, but we've deleted our passwords. So we're not responsible now for how that code gets used. So you can't pin it on us. Now, that defense was run in court and didn't turn out too well for a couple of the people behind Tornado Cash. But what it tapped into is, again, this very forward-looking idea of finance. But in a world of future finance, we're talking about things like cryptocurrency, but video game currency as well, NFTs. The people who control how that world will run is not your JP Morgans and your Goldman Sachs's. It's a bunch of guys writing code on their computers, and 5 lines of code can completely upend your financial system. I thought that was fascinating. And the people who are behind Tornado Cash and backing it, they look at the world that you and I live in, Matt, and that, the clients that you work with, these big banks you work with, they look at that as an old, fusty and dysfunctional world of finance. They look ahead to this new world of finance, and they are going to control it and make it better. So that whole Axie Infinity Tornado Cash case was, in those sci-fi movies when you go into a time tunnel or you go into a time warp, it just felt like moving into the future at high speed. So interesting. So that was one of the craziest cases I put in the book. Certainly.
Yeah, but there are also real world victims at the user level. And I remember in the book, you were talking to one of the victims that basically lost everything and was still playing with the hopes of, because the value went way down. And so everything he had was pretty much gone. And I feel like one of the things that we often overlook is the victim impact. And then when you start thinking about these scam factories that have taken off all around the world, but specifically in that part of the world, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, do you think that we're in a next gen of fraud and scams? Or because it was online sale of PII, it was payment cards, it was all of that stuff, and now it seems like it's authorized push payment fraud. Do you see it the same way as sort of like the thing that will affect most people?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue, certainly in terms of the fraud figures we're seeing in the UK, I'm pretty sure it'd be the same in the US and lots of other countries. I think it's fair to say we're in an epidemic of fraud. It's where you talk to somebody who hasn't either been caught out or had somebody else been caught out. There seems to be an unending supply of ingenuity as to how these frauds are done. Only yesterday I was hearing about telecoms fraud and some of the things going on there are absolutely astonishing and so ingenious, these frauds. And so I think there's going to be some long tail effects of COVID. And I think one of the long tail effects of COVID is that we all shifted much more online than we had before. We were already very online, but we shifted much more online. A lot of people went online and we just got used to dealing remotely with things and with people is one thing. Second thing is we've still seen, again, the rise and rise of cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency valuations and cryptocurrency penetration. So under the incoming president in the US, we've seen the value of Bitcoin roughly double since he was voted in. We've also seen things like the Bitcoin spot ETF, a financial product that is now a Bitcoin product that you can invest in your pension fund. So we're seeing sort of crypto rise up. What that does give the opportunity for is for crooks to perpetrate scams around crypto. And the point I think I'd make about those scam compounds in Southeast Asia, which you've talked about, these factories full of effectively slave labor, often trafficked slave labor, forced by threat of violence to scam people. That's obviously cooking and it's really, really going well. And I think the thing that's been missed in a lot of people's assessment of that is that the laundering around those crypto thefts those scam compounds are doing is so much easier and cheaper than a lot of the laundering that got done elsewhere. We've had, for example, romance scammers for ages. You can romance scam somebody, but there's case after case with those romance scammers where they scam somebody, but then they're like, well, how do I get this victim's money out of the US? I can't get them to transfer it to an account in Nigeria or Colombia or whatever it is. So they've had to pay for laundering services. Whenever they get a victim in the US, they might take them for, let's say, $1 million. Fine. But you're going to lose hundreds of thousands potentially as you try and get the money out of the US. Compare that to a scammer in Southeast Asia who scams someone in the US in crypto. Within seconds, less than seconds if you're good at it, the money's in Southeast Asia in your crypto wallet. Now, yeah, you still have to kind of transfer it into fiat, and that is a process. But you haven't had to pay some dude in the US in Illinois somewhere to do your laundering for you. The Southeast Asian scam guys in those scam compounds, the bosses, for every scam they do, they are making 20, 30, 40, 50% more per scam because they don't have to pay the laundering fees that they have to if it's a victim in the US. So I think that's why those Southeast Asian compounds are doing well and why that's kicking and why that's an engine of fraud is because they're just more profitable. It's the same way Amazon is profitable because they try and avoid as much tax as they can, legally, I should say. But
Yeah.
so that Amazon does really well. The guys in Southeast Asia, they're trimming down their overheads. And when you trim down your overheads as an organization, you just make more money. You are more successful. You expand. That's why Southeast Asia's cooking, I think.
And the dollar losses, as you said, in the U.S., they're rising just like in the UK. I think it was maybe 6 billion reported loss to the IC3 last year in just crypto investment scams. What do you think the good guys could do better?
I'm not in the industry. I'd have to solve these problems. I'm a journalist. I can just write about them, which is a glorious position to be in. But the one thing I would say is this: is that the more I cover this and the more I work on this, the harder I find it to see the distinctions between cybercrime, fraud, and money laundering. I mean, look at the cases we talked about, Gala Bellamari, Roman Abbas, the famous Hush Puppy and Big Boss combo that you investigated successfully as well. I'm not quite clear which bits of their work was cybercrime and bits were money laundering. I'm sure when it comes to court, when lawyers can tell you about all of that. But I think on the criminal side, time and time again, I see organized crime operations where they've seamlessly integrated all bits of that journey, or at the very least, their departments are working really, really well together. And what worries me is, on the other side, for institutions, banks, particularly financial institutions, there's a tendency to separate these things out. Cybercrime and cybersecurity is dealt with in the IT department. Fraud is sort of dealt with in kind of the compliance department. Then you've got another sort of department for anti-money laundering over here. That's not good. Your adversaries, your opponents, the guys who are trying to stiff you, they're bringing those departments together and doing it really seamlessly and running it really smoothly, and even making a distinction between those things. If on your side you're splitting those teams up, you're going to be at a disadvantage. It's the same way in football. If all of your defense is on the right and left wing, they're just going to come straight down the centre at you. You've got to match what your adversary is doing. You've got to mark your man, to use another footballing analogy. And I think more and more financial institutions need to do that. Really, if you can do it, I think this might really help. Bring those teams together, at least get them having a meeting every now and again. Because as soon as those people start talking, they'll realize, whoa, okay, so you're working on, well, I'm working the other side of that. And actually, we could work together. I think there's so many, hate the word, but synergies that could be done there. And it's what the bad guys are doing. So the good guys, I think, should do it as well.
I like your analogy, especially for somebody that I think hates football. You told me
I
you're
really
not a
hate
big
football, yeah.
I like that. So do you also think that there's a dismissiveness to victims of scams that you don't see if it's a victim of a hack?
That's a very good question, actually. I think traditionally, yes, there has been this, well, you're a fool, you fell for it. I won't name the institution, but I was at dinner the other day at an event, and somebody was talking about a competition they had among their bank anti-fraud experts, a sort of drinking club kind of competition of stupidest victim. And they talked about people who'd paid and then kept paying and paying and paying. That really concerned me. I thought that was pretty cruel. Yes, it may seem insane. Yes, they may seem crazy, but fundamentally they're still victims of crime. I think that's changing. I think because so many people are affected by scams and there are so many victims, I think we're changing in that perspective. Victims of hacks, you're right. I think there's maybe more sympathy or at least less dismissiveness of victims of hacks. But that's often because it's really hard to work out how the person got hacked. I mean, there's so many different ways of stealing people's passwords, tricking people into giving passwords. I've got a friend I'm working with at the moment to try and work out how they got into his Instagram account. I thought, well, I'm sure I'll be able to get to the bottom of this, investigative journalist that I am. No, we've got no idea. There's so many different ways that could have happened. Yeah. So I think that, yes, there's a dismissiveness sometimes of fraud victims. I think that doesn't happen with cyber victims because you just don't know how it happened. What I hope is in the future we can not only take these victims seriously, but also gather the intel from these victims. There's so much intel that can be pulled from victims. Every victim, I think, has got a thread that you can pull that can lead you to other victims. And that's what I do worry about with law enforcement, is that a victim comes in, has a story, they try and investigate it. What they don't see is that victim could be a conduit to a whole community. But I'm glad you said that, because that's the sense I have. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Matt.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I hope that's changing. I think it is to some degree in law enforcement. But the problem in law enforcement is if you have local law enforcement, they have to deal with, when I say real crimes, I don't mean it pejorative, because they're all crimes, but I mean like real property crimes, like under the definition, somebody steals a car, somebody breaks into your house, like they're taking property, or if there's murders and rapes and all that other stuff. And so your job is to keep the city, town safe. And the perception is from physical bodily harm. And so you're not putting a lot of emphasis on these kinds of crimes because you don't have the resources to do it. And it takes you out of a jurisdiction. I spent 10 years in a small town in New Hampshire, and you get a victim coming in saying, I sent $1 million in a crypto investment scam. They're going to say, well, my authorities are somewhat limited to a degree. My expertise is somewhat limited to a degree, and I don't know how I can help you. And so we're looking at AI to help with that sort of human in loop expertise to provide that to state and local law enforcement so they can scale, because the problem is that even if they have 2 or 3 and you're a large city, you might get hundreds and hundreds of complaints coming in, and it just becomes overwhelming. The other thing that I think, and this is just my take, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is part of the reason why the epidemic of scams has gone up is because the people suffering the loss are not banks, they're individual consumers. And individual consumers don't have a powerful lobby. They don't have the American Bankers Association or the Bank Policy Institute, or they don't have somebody saying, hey, wait a second, Congress, we need to change this, or we need to do something different collectively. Just, millions of people all around the world. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who are suffering the loss. So, I'm curious, do you agree that that's part of the problem as well? And I'm not advocating that, somebody else should shoulder all of the burden. And if I would, it would be probably social media to some degree. But I think that's probably part of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Certainly it's true to say in cybercrime. And I think in a lot of cybercrime and a lot of fraud, I wouldn't say all of it, but a lot, you have what I call the Superman 2 tactic of crime. Superman 2 was not a greatly received Superman movie, but the plot of it involved as a bank worker played by Richard Pryor, and he discovered a glitch where the bank was effectively writing off the fractions of a cent at the end of every transaction. So he wrote a computer program that just gathered all those fractions of a cent and put them all in one account. And sure enough, the next day he turns up in a Ferrari with a mink coat kind of thing. And I think that's the issue is, as an organised crime group, what you want to hit on is some kind of low and slow attack where it never rises to the point where people really complain about it, and therefore it never really gets on law enforcement's radar, and therefore it never really gets any resources to get tackled by the authorities. And you can look at those kind of low-level frauds and low-level cybercrimes as being that kind of low and slow, below the radar. We only make $5 per victim, but we've got 1 million victims. That's your ideal. Now, previously it was quite difficult to do that, because imagine you have some scam where you phone people up and you trick them into donating $5 to a charity that doesn't exist. That's an easy way. And if you can do that to 1 million people, then you get 5 million, but you've got to make 1 million phone calls. That's just not going to work. What technology has added to this is the idea of scale, that you can do a small amount fraud, but at scale. And I think that's been the change. And I do worry that this is why treating each victim as a thread that you can pull is important, because the victim standing in front of you may only have lost $5, but they are the conduit towards the person who's been doing that to 1 million people. But like you say, lots of those other millions of victims will not be in your jurisdiction, and will not be in your police station, and will not be complaining, and might never have even noticed it. I think the other point to bring up is, if you're not convinced enough by our arguments so far, think about where this money's ending up at. So with North Korea, for example, this is a country that is actively pursuing nuclear weapons that will potentially hit the US. That's what they want, is a US-capable weapon. So $500 million ending up there, that's not just a computer hack, that's actually quite a serious issue. If you look at the scam stuff, if it is going to these Southeast Asian scam compounds, you've got Chinese organized crime gangs running these places, deeply unsavory people. You are also funding people trafficking, because they're trafficking people to work in the scam compounds. You've also got funding of military juntas and warlords, effectively, in places like Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos. You are further destabilizing countries that are already struggling to stay stable. So even if you're not convinced in terms of like the victims, think of where this money's going. And it might be only a few dollars from this victim, but it's feeding into this flood of money going into people around the world who we don't want to have large resources. That's how I'd think of it anyway.
Yeah, and because of the difficulty in prosecuting these cases, probably from a U.S. and U.K. perspective, it's really going to take, in my opinion, private sector to really step up. And so whether it's cutting off Starlink or social media, I saw the report that Meta said that 10% of their profit came from scams. Or something along those lines. And we always look at banks as to fix a problem, but really, I think this is a shared problem. And some countries, I know the UK is looking at it, and Australia about sort of a shared loss model. My view is in the United States, we need sort of like a National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, like a NCMEC for scams. That's a nonprofit, because we need to get private sector sharing information more lawfully, and they're not going to share it directly to the government, and nor probably should they, for privacy reasons. But you need to have that central common operating picture, because to your point, all of these individual victims, death by 1,000 cuts, if we're not bringing them all together into one central sort of area and then exploiting the information that they can provide, then we're still going to continue to see loss after loss after loss.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I know that there's conversations about that. The Aspen Institute put together a report talking about how we need to change, at least in the United States, how we're combating scams. The other kind of piece that is normally overlooked by scams, even though the dollar losses are so high, is ransomware. And ransomware is also one, to me, that can be frustrating because we've been dealing with this for quite a while, but really haven't made any material progress. Why do you think that is?
It's a very good question. So I can happily announce now, because it's gone public, that we're making a new series of the Lazarus heist, which has been renamed Cyber Hack. So it's no longer just about North Korea. There's a current series of Cyber Hack, which is about a Russian organized crime gang who literally called themselves Evil Corp. It's amazing. Yep. My series next year is going to be about ransomware and the industry of ransomware. So yeah, ransomware is a really interesting example. Going back to that Superman 2 example of crime, low and slow, making small amounts, but from lots of victims. That's how ransomware started out. And it was meant to be automated. It was meant to be a completely automated crime. The ransomware would be spread. It would hit a victim's network. The victim would start sobbing and start paying the ransom, and the ransom would move in Bitcoin. That's not quite how it's worked out. You do need to negotiate with your victim. And increasingly, these ransomware gangs started going after organizations, not individuals. And instead of hitting up an individual for $300 or whatever you can get out of them, you're hitting the organization, the business, for millions. And at that stage, you do need to negotiate with your victim because they're going to want to be convinced that you can unscramble their data, which is what you're holding for ransom, effectively, scrambled data. And so this whole industry grew up. There was a couple of things that really jettisoned or launched the ransomware industry into the stratosphere. And I think probably the big one was the franchise model, the affiliate model of ransomware. Ransomware is a numbers game. The more victims you hit, the more ransoms you get. That's what it is. The ransomware gangs, the people who actually write this ransomware, the coders, that's what they do. They're very good at writing encryption software that works really quickly. That's what you need for ransomware. But spreading it is a whole other challenge. You've got to be sending out phishing emails. You've sometimes got to be phoning up companies and blagging passwords, tricking people to giving passwords. It's a whole other area. And so what happened was the guys who wrote the ransomware code said, look, we're not very good at that. So we will effectively create an affiliate model where we will write the ransomware. Anyone can pay us to have a copy of it. And when they infect a victim, we will split the ransom with them. We'll get 20%, they get 80%. And suddenly, immediately, there's no limit to the number of ransomware operators you can have because anybody can be a ransomware operator. And you start to see hundreds of affiliates getting recruited. And what's fascinating about that is some of those affiliates are really expert cybercriminals who've been doing it for decades. Some of them, frankly, are what we call in the UK numpties, people who are sort of new to it, kind of fancy themselves a bit of a cybercriminal, don't know what they're doing. So they end up ransoming, I don't know, a children's school, like an infant school or like a preschool, who obviously don't have any money and can't pay. Yeah. So you see this variety of ransomware as well. You see this big range of victims, some of it very professional, big victims, big amounts of money, some of it tiny victims who are never going to pay up. But what it's meant is an explosion in the overall volume of ransomware. Again, jurisdictionally, the franchise system means that the operator of the ransomware could be anywhere, based anywhere. And in terms of the actual writers of the ransomware, as far as we know, mainly based in the Russian Federation. Again, thanks to the war in Ukraine, often beyond the reach of law enforcement, not going to be extradited. So for lots of reasons, ransomware has become the key engine and has been, I think, the key engine of cybercrime for about 10 years now. It's amazing, its longevity, its profitability, its adaptability. It's a really remarkable criminological phenomenon. And for my money, every criminologist in every university should be getting on it and studying it. It's fascinating. Yeah. I'm surprised there aren't more academics looking at this.
Yeah. And we've been focused a lot here in some of the work that I'm doing with companies is creating immutable backups. Because if you can guarantee you can back up, then you've eliminated the need to pay the ransom. So
well, yes and no. The ransomware gangs have thought of that and thought, well, what if a victim has a backup, they won't pay it?
Yes.
So the next evolution, this was the second thing that put ransomware into the stratosphere, was steal data. Don't just encrypt it, steal some of it. And then if the victim refuses to pay because they've got a backup, your next threat is to say, well, we'll leak your data if you don't pay up.
Yeah.
So, backups is good. Don't get me wrong, backups are a really good idea. Keep doing it. Yeah. But just be aware, it's not the silver bullet, as they say.
And what about the double extortion, where they'll have you seen a fair amount of that, where you'll pay, but then they'll also threaten to then release the data as well. And then what I don't typically understand is about the extortion piece of releasing the data. You're dealing with cyber criminals. Do you really believe that they're just going to sit on that data and delete it? Right? I mean, if everybody just said, look, you have my data, I'm not paying you because I don't trust you. There's no reason in the world why I should trust you. Then you would
Yep.
think that that model would go down a little bit. But unfortunately,
Yep.
it hasn't. And how much of that do you think is, again, I'm pulling on a little bit of a conspiracy hill that I stand on, is cyber insurance? And
Mm.
how much in paying for recovering from ransomware has affected the explosion? Because if you think
Yep.
about it, if I can get into your systems, I could probably find your policy and I could probably know exactly how much money I can get out of your insurance carrier. You think there's anything
Yep.
to that?
I do, and we know from the leaks from some of these ransomware gangs that that's exactly what they do. They
Yeah.
will take the policy document, see how much you're insured for, and ask for that as a ransom because they know you can recover it from the insurer. Look, in an ideal world, we would have a ban on any company paying ransoms to a ransomware gang. We would just ban it. That's if we could fast forward to a perfect world and we could make it all work. Obviously, ethically, that's what we should be doing. In my mind, it's obvious. But when you actually think of the mechanics of how you implement that, so what, you're going to ban somebody from paying a ransom? And if they do pay a ransom, what, you're going to prosecute them?
Right.
This is a victim of crime after all. And also, if you ban them and then the company goes under and 100 people get sacked, which does happen. So what, the government's now got 100 people out of work. And what about medical sector? If a hospital can't function, you just let people suffer and potentially die? We have had a death from ransomware in the UK recently, by the way, attributed death. So whilst in a perfect world, we would all not pay the criminals, that's just not how it works. And the corollary of that is the fact that, of course, since it's a risk, insurance companies exist to insure it. It's a deeply murky world. I suspect quite a lot of people, even in the ransomware insurance industry, wish it didn't exist, wish they didn't, in a way, have a job. But they do, because there's a demand for it, because we are not in that perfect world. But you're right, it's a deeply murky thing. And ransomware negotiation, again, deeply sort of murky territory. You can get a discount. You can negotiate a discount with the ransomware operators. You can also get some interesting insight from negotiating with a ransomware operator. But you are negotiating at that point with criminals. It's not ideal. I don't think it's what anybody would want to do. But we are where we are.
And I think there is a place for cyber insurance. And I think there are some insurance carriers that do it better than others, in the sense of, if I have to get life insurance, I got to go to a doctor and I got to do my blood work and before they start insuring. I think that there has been some evolution where you're just not writing policies to organizations that are not adhering to whatever the standards are. And speaking of the standards, a lot of the challenges are the standards are delayed and not up to date to meet today's threat. Again, bad guys are more agile. So when you look at sort of like NIST or other frameworks on backups, it's, do you have offline backups? Yes or no? Do you update them? Yes or no? That's the only questions. And we need to start diving into more about the resiliency of an organization to be robust. You're right that they could just exfil the data. You should be able to see that. And I get, sometimes for whatever reason that doesn't happen. You also have insider threats. You have a whole bunch of other factors to deal with. But it is something that I think probably 5 or 6 years ago really spiked the rise and got a lot of people interested, especially the bad actors. I don't think ransomware created additional bad actors. I think it just migrated them to a much more lucrative job, as opposed to if I break into a big box retailer and steal 5 million credit cards and start trying to sell those credit cards. Well, that's a lot of effort. Whereas if I could just get you to pay me $5 million, that's my ROI is a lot better.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. So, well, Geoff White, I really appreciate your time. I always love talking to you, and
me too.
This has been wonderful. Looking forward to the new podcast coming out. And again, I say it with all sincerity, and I've said this a million times. Your books are the best, and we'll put links into the podcast notes where to get your books and your podcasts. So, Geoff, I look forward to seeing you on the road. Hopefully, here again soon as well.
Thanks, and likewise, Matt. Always enjoy talking to you. Such a wealth of experience you've got. It's always an intriguing conversation. My brain is slightly fizzing with what we've been talking about. But thanks so much for having me on, and hopefully see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. Really appreciate it. And thank you for everybody for listening to Detonation Point presented by Elastio, and we'll see you next week.